Welcome to the Mission First People Always podcast. We're glad you're here. And now our host, Dr. Mike Patterson.
It's Dr. Mike Patterson, your host of the Mission First People Always podcast, where we talk about what it takes to be a great leader and how to build a great team. I'm glad you're with us. And if you like what you hear on today's episode or any of our past episodes, please leave a review and subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast. It helps new people find us and benefit from the content we provide. Here's what's in store for you on today's episode. We're going to have a conversation with an author and consultant who has helped thousands of people make the transition from doer to leader. It's an important and difficult transition. It's not surprising that most internal promotions are given to people who are top performers in their current roles. The assumption is that if this person is a great individual contributor, whether it be a salesperson, engineer, marketing analyst, or whatever, the belief is that surely they will be a great manager or leader. After all, they're smart, diligent, and loyal, right? Well, the reality is that many people who move from a team member role into a team leader role struggle. Oftentimes, they stay focused on tasks, perhaps the work that used to be the center of their universe, but they don't invest in building the kind of relationships with their followers that create a thriving team. I've been known to say just about every time I get in front of a room that a primary responsibility for leaders is to bring out the best in the people around them. Today, we're going to explore this issue and work to better understand how to turn doers into leaders.
Welcome to the Mission First People Always podcast, where we talk about better business results, stronger teams, more successful careers, and happier lives. Along the way, we hope to bust some biases, build some bridges, and have some fun. We're glad you're here. And now, our host, Dr. Mike Patterson.
My guest today is Vanessa Judelman. She's the president of Mosaic People Development, a company that develops leaders who inspire great results. Over the last 20 years, she has coached and developed thousands of people across the globe who want to be strong leaders. In her book, Mastering Leadership: What It Takes to Lead in Today's Fast-Paced World, Vanessa identifies the key problems facing leaders today and provides compelling solutions for the most common leadership challenges. Her goal through the book is to create confident, self-aware, and strategic leaders. Vanessa has been quoted in the Globe and Mail, a Canadian newspaper with 2 million weekly readers printed in 5 cities across Western Canada, and the National Post, another Canadian newspaper, and is a regular contributor to CKNW Radio, a news station in Vancouver, British Columbia. Vanessa is also guest lecturer in the MBA program at the Ted Rogers School of Management and works with a wide array of world-class organizations. Vanessa, all the way from Canada, welcome to the Mission First People Always podcast.
Great to be here, Mike.
Well, I'm pleased to have a Canadian on the podcast today. I find myself in Canada several times each year working with clients, and I love my Canadian friends. I'm even in Toronto next week, so I am a friend of Canadians. But I have a confession to make that even though I'm in Canada a lot and I love my Canadian friends, I haven't really come to truly appreciate poutine like a true Canadian. I don't get it. Can you shed any light on the delicacy that you guys enjoy, poutine?
Who doesn't like French fries with gravy and cheese, Mike? I mean, really, what's not to love about French fries, gravy, and cheese?
It sounds like an express ticket to the cardiologist from my perspective, but hey, I'm just an American and probably don't get it. But the whole, the cooking show is another podcast. That's not why we're here. We're here to talk about leadership. The whole point of Mission First People Always is to talk about how we can become better leaders and build stronger teams. And I think we have an important topic to take on today. It's a topic that you're a well-known expert on. And this transition from being a doer, someone who's really good as an individual contributor, who's a subject matter expert, perhaps, who gets promoted and is now leading a team. Why is this such a difficult transition for many to make?
Well, you know what? To be really honest, I would have to say two things. The first thing is people are promoted without education. So, and the second thing is leadership's a different job. So it was like, I like to use the analogy of driving a car. Funnily enough, my older son just turned 16. And I always say to people, if your child was turning 16, it was time for them to learn how to drive, would you just give them the car keys and say, off you go, now drive? Of course not. You send them to driver's education class. They have online lessons. They have lessons in a car. And it's the same with leaders. Basically, what most organizations do is they literally give people who are promoted into leadership role the car keys and say, now drive. But they don't give them classes and tools and mentoring and education to learn how to do the job, because it really is a different job.
So where does that leave this newly promoted manager, this new leader who didn't take driver's ed for learning how to lead people? How do they do it? Do they just kind of stumble along, recalling models in their past, or where do they struggle most?
Well, how they do it typically is they tend to follow their leaders who likely did not have training and coaching and mentoring either, or it's a little bit of trial by error. They try something, it works, it doesn't work, and they kind of figure it out. The thing about when leaders have leadership training, what it does, it accelerates their learning. So they're able to learn tools and strategies really quicker. And so they're not fumbling. I just actually wrapped up a 3-month coaching client today. And I said to her, what did you find? Because she's somebody who's been in her role for 5 years, been a leader for 5 years. And I said, what did you get out of coaching? Like, where were you before you got any kind of development? And she said, honestly, Vanessa, I felt really insecure and stressed out about being a leader because I wasn't sure that I was, quote unquote, doing it right. And so that's where I think a lot of people are when they start leading for the first time. They don't have confidence and they're really not sure if they're, quote unquote, doing it right.
And Vanessa, you are in the leadership, the people development business. You lead a firm called Mosaic People Development. Tell us a little bit about that firm, what you do, and how you arrived at this point in your career. And then I want to get back to this transition between doer to leader, because that is a big step for people. But tell our audience a little bit about your background and what gives you the right to speak about this topic.
For sure. Yeah. Great question. So I started my career, I would say actually when I was about 10 years old. I always loved teaching. It's always been a passion of mine. And I was always a student peer teacher. I actually went to McGill University in Montreal, where they eat a lot of poutine. And I studied education there. And I was a teacher of at-risk youth for many years. And then I'd had a few too many binders thrown at my head. And I decided, you know what, this is not my jam anymore. So I moved into the corporate world and I worked for a training and consulting company for 10 years, where I learned to develop leaders and worked with leaders in every industry across the globe. I did that for many years and realized, you know what, I'd like to move in-house and actually run my own team. I don't want to be the kind of consultant who just has learned by reading books. So I moved in-house, I grew and managed and developed many different teams myself. And that was the best experience of my career, because I realized leadership is really hard. I built high-performing teams. I built teams that weren't performing that high. I had people that loved my style as a leader. I had people who really didn't appreciate my style as a leader. And I learned the most from those people. And then after many years of working in corporate Canada, I decided, you know what, I'd love to start my own business. And when I did that, I could do a lot of things. I could do strategic planning, I could do team development, I could do many things. And I had to really think about, what am I most passionate about? What do I really love to do? And that's when I landed on developing leaders. And the reason I'm so passionate about it is because leaders really set the tone. I was reading the recent Gallup organization research for 2022, and still people, about 14 to 16% of employees are actively disengaged at work. And why are most of them quitting or leaving their jobs is because they don't like their leaders and managers. So that's why I'm so passionate about leadership. And I've been running my organization, Mosaic People Development, for 11 years now, is because leaders make or break people's experience at work. And so what leaders do really matters.
Absolutely. If I were a leader in a firm in Canada, I know I've got a need for developing new leaders as we move them up in the organization. They're young, they're bright, they're talented, they're energized and excited about these new opportunities, but they don't have that foundational skill set for leading people. What are some of, and I call you, Vanessa, what will you do for my people who need to take this step? What are some of the core skills that you would focus these folks on as part of their journey?
For sure. So whether I do one-on-one coaching or, take a group of leaders through a training program, I focus on what I call the 3 pillars of leadership success. And how I came up with these 3 pillars is when I started my business, I'd been in consulting for many years and in-house for many years, and I'd done a lot of needs analysis. And I thought, you know what? I wanted to get the data out and see what are some of the core themes that every leader really needs to focus on, regardless of their role or the industry they work on. So I took out pieces of paper and I put them all over my wall in my office, and I really looked at common themes that most leaders have that are challenging for them. And I realized that these areas fall into 3 pillars or 3 buckets. So the first is leaders have to know themselves. They have to have self-awareness. They have to be able to manage their team, and they have to be able to lead your business. Many leaders don't even know that that's their job, is to know themselves, manage their team, and lead their business. So those pillars form the foundation of all the training and coaching that I do.
Do you always start with this self-awareness piece, know yourself, and what are some of the ways in which you help people become more self-aware? Do you use psychometric assessments? Is it 360 feedback? How exactly do you do that for new leaders?
For sure. Yeah, you're right, Mike. I do start with self-awareness, with that know yourself pillar. It's critical. And, it's really interesting. Even the research shows that more self-aware, happier leaders are deemed as more effective. I think the research was something like 75% more effective than those leaders who aren't self-aware. So it's important to start there. And in terms of assessments, I've used many over the years. I have 2 favorites. One is the DISC profile, which looks at your work style, whether you're dominant or an influencer or steady or conscientious. The other one is HBDI, which is less well known, and that's the Herman Brain Dominance Instrument, which looks at your thinking styles. And the reason I also like that one is because we're paid to think at work. And so what this looks at is how you think and your thinking style. So I love both, and they're really, really super interesting. And what they both show us is that all of us as leaders have strengths and have weaknesses, and that's okay. It's actually normal. All of us have areas that we thrive in as a leader and that we find challenging to manage as leaders. And that's normal too. And when I tell leaders that, they're so grateful to hear that, because they think, oh, wait, I should be perfect at everything as a leader. And I always say to them, that's not true. You have to know what you're good at and leverage those strengths. And then you have to really understand what you're not good at. So for example, Mike, you're probably aware of this, but a lot of leaders struggle to give feedback or manage conflict because they don't want to hurt people's feelings. So they tend to avoid it. But what I do is I teach leaders, how do you manage conflict, or how do you give feedback in a way that feels authentic to you based on your own leadership style or thinking style?
Yeah, I do believe leaders, and the literature supports this, are notoriously bad at giving feedback. In fact, the phenomenon is often referred to as the idiosyncratic feedback effect, this idea that we give feedback about things that are important to us as the manager, but we miss really hitting the target for what matters to the person on the receiving end of our feedback. And as a result, our feedback isn't very effective because we're just talking about stuff we care about, or we're not facing up to those crucial conversations that really have an impact on people. I'm wondering, in this vein of self-awareness, this isn't something that we need to wait to do until we move into a leadership role. I would think that this is good advice for anyone at any point in their professional career, even folks who are entering the workforce for the first time. They're coming out of university, they're in their first job. Is self-awareness something we should start building sooner than later?
Oh, yeah, that's an excellent point. I mean, you could start building self-awareness with high school students too, to prepare them for college and university. I think it's a lifelong tool that we all need to be able to develop, Mike, is really understand ourselves, what makes us tick, what our strengths are, what our weaknesses are. Yeah, I think it's a quality, or it's something that we should all strive for, is to be more self-aware. I actually read an interesting article by Daniel Goleman, who's very well known for writing about emotional intelligence. And his new book talks about meditation and self-awareness and emotional intelligence, and how all of those areas are so linked to people's success at work. So yeah, all the research Goleman has been doing around emotional intelligence is really linked to self-awareness and success at work.
Yeah, and I think students who start leaning into those ideas and those practices in university or even earlier are more effective as students, because the way we interact with our colleagues in the classroom, and the way we do projects, and the way we live on campus will directly influence our work experience as well in that time of transition. So, you talked about 3 pillars. We talked about where you tend to start is knowing oneself, that self-awareness piece. And we've agreed that starting sooner versus later is key there. Second piece of your 3-pillar model is managing the team. What does that look like, and how do you help people develop that?
So managing your team is all about really knowing how to build a high-performing team. And the 2 most critical parts, in my opinion, to build a high-performing team are, 1, to coach your people, and 2 is to know how to develop your people. So a lot of leaders don't know even what coaching is. I mean, there's 2 different distinct parts of coaching. There's formal coaching, which are those one-on-one meetings you need to have. But there's also informal coaching, which is just day-to-day conversations that you have with people. And then the piece around developing your team, most leaders have no idea how to do that. I actually use a great tool for that called the situational leadership model, which has been around for years. It's not an old tool, but it's so good. And what it helps leaders to understand is, if you're going to develop your team, you have to be able to identify people's competence and commitment level, right? If you are delegating to someone who's got low competence in a task, you have to be fairly directive with them. If you're developing someone who's got low commitment, the way that you coach and develop them is going to be a little bit different. So the situational leadership model, if anyone's unfamiliar with it, just Google it or go on YouTube. There's some wonderful videos on the situational leadership model. And it's all about how you as a leader need to change or adjust your style to meet the needs of your team. So if you're developing someone who's brand new to a task, for example, one of my coaching clients this morning, I was talking to her about the fact that she's onboarded somebody who came from university into her organization. She's been with them 2 years, and it's her first job. And she asked her to take more initiative. And I said to her, what does that even mean? This person doesn't know what take initiative means in the context of your business. So you need to break it down. So we actually in Zoom went on the whiteboard and made a list of what it means to take initiative. because this person's early stage of their career and is new to developing that goal. So this leader had to be much more directive in terms of how she's going to coach this person to take initiative.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. We oftentimes assume that the language we use is understood by the people on the receiving end of us, when in reality, words mean different things to people or don't mean anything at all. So we often have to get to the point where we say, what does it look like in your context to take initiative, and how can I communicate this idea very clearly to my employee who is at this level? And if it's a new to the workplace, right out of university sort of person, that process is going to look different than the 20-year veteran who's done this work for as long as the new employee's been alive. The big difference.
Yeah, I love that term you use, Mike. What does this look like? I think that's just a great question for leaders to ask themselves when they are delegating and developing to other people, is answer that question for yourself. What does this look like?
Yeah, I often add to that with what does winning look like in this situation? What does success look like? Let's picture it. Let's visualize it. Let's put it on the whiteboard, as you just said, so that we're all really clear what we're shooting for. The name of this podcast is Mission First, People Always, and having clarity about what our mission is, what's really important, what are we striving for, what does success look like? If we don't get that right first, or that's not clear to people up front, everything else is going to be a lot harder. The other piece of your 3-pillar model, the third pillar of your model, is lead your business. I want to give you a chance to speak to that a little bit. What do leaders need to know, and what skills do they need to develop to effectively lead their business?
That's really about leading and managing change. It's around prioritization, really understanding what you're paid to do and focusing on your priorities. It's around time management. It's around executing strategically. I mean, even when you think about executing strategically, I'll often ask the leaders that I'm working with, what do you think it means to be strategic? And many of them don't actually know. So often their bosses their leader or manager will say to them, I need you to be more strategic, but they don't know what that means. So for example, when I work with leaders on my module called Executing Strategically, we break down strategy into 3 sections, right? You need to be able to think strategically, you need to be able to plan strategically, and you need to be able to implement strategically. And those things are very different.
Yeah, I think that goes back to our previous point. What does it look like to think strategically? And I think you're right. New leaders get feedback. You need to be more strategic. And if you don't know what that means, it's hard to do it. And so I think breaking it down is a key to understanding that. So what would it, I mean, let's play our own game here. What would it look like to think more strategically?
So thinking strategically is all about challenging the status quo and thinking outside of the box. So many people do things because they've always done them that way. I speak to leaders all the time. I say, well, help me understand, why do you do your performance reviews that way? Well, because we've always done them that way. Well, what? And then I start asking them questions like, what are the results of that? And what do you think you could do to have a performance conversation that's a little more impactful and meaningful and effective? So thinking strategically is about challenging the status quo, thinking outside of the box, doing things differently, and not just assuming that the way we've always done is the right way. And I always say to people, when you onboard a new person, within the first 3 days of you onboarding that person, ask them, what are we doing around here that's really good? What are we doing around here that you think could be improved? And what is an idea of how we could improve that? Because when a new person comes in, they have a lens from their past organization, and they see different ways you can do something, and they have fresh eyes. So I think it's just great also to, when you want to plan strategically and think creatively as someone who's new to your organization, what their perspective is as well.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent idea. The expression I often use is effective leaders remain humbly curious, recognizing that the way we do it might not be the only way, it might not be the best way, and I'm humble enough to stay curious and inquire about other options, opportunities, other experiences that you bring. I think that humble curiosity is critical for effective leaders as well. So I get it, Vanessa. You invest your heart and soul into giving new leaders these skills. But one of the challenges we all face in the learning and development space is how do we make the learning stick? That's sort of a cliche expression, but I think it's really relevant and always should be top of mind for learning leaders and people who do what we do. How do we help people transfer what we give them in the classroom and on coaching calls and in developmental conversations to their daily, work? How do we change behavior with the ideas we share with people? How do we make it all stick? And what makes it hard to translate, ideas and insights into action?
I think the key expression you use there is behavioral change. That's what we're usually looking for. And behavioral change takes time. When I work with a leader, it's usually, sometimes I'll work for about 3 months with a leader, but it's usually 5, 6, 7, 8, 12 months that I'm working with somebody. It's a long-term commitment, because when you want to change your behavior, it's incremental shifts in behavioral change. So one of the leaders I was coaching last week is really looking at speaking up more in meetings. And I said to her, we talked about this 3 months ago. How are you feeling about speaking up more in meetings? Do you feel like you're speaking up more now than 3 months ago? She said, I do, Vanessa. I'm still not there, but I see a difference now between 3 months from now. And that's what people need to know, is that behavioral change really takes time. And when I work with people, we have homework. You have to implement. So behavioral change takes time. It requires implementation. And that's why when you want to change your behavior as a leader and learn new skills, some people read a book, but they don't apply what they've learned. And that's why working with a coach or taking a training program, all of my training programs are at least, again, 3, 6, 8 months, because we learn a concept. I call it drip learning, right? I'll teach you a concept. You'll go out and apply it. So you learn the concept. That's drip 1. You go out and apply it. That's drip 2. We come back. We talk about what worked and we didn't. That's drip 3. You go into a breakout. You share with a partner what you did. That's drip 4. So drip learning is really important, that you're constantly talking about what you did, applying things, assessing what worked and what didn't, and then reapplying them again and again over time.
Vanessa, we all live at least part of the time online, on Zoom. More and more of us are spending less and less time face to face with people. And sometimes our organizations have established everybody's going to work remote policies rather. Some organizations are transitioning back into the workplace. It's in flux. We're all sort of hung over from Zoom fatigue. And is this stuff we're talking about harder to do when we're not physically together, when we're always on Zoom or often on Zoom? How does the virtual workplace affect learning to be a better leadership and applying these new leadership skills?
Yeah, I definitely think it's harder to do it in a virtual world. Most of my leaders that live in Toronto, I'm saying to them, let's meet in person again, just to have those conversations without muting yourself and unmuting yourself. But that being said, when I think about learning, it's really about human connection and personal connection. And so you can create those relationships by giving people opportunities to connect in breakouts and things like that. So, I think the reality, this hybrid world is the reality. And so leaders need to think about their year. I'm telling the leaders that I work with to plan now. When you're working with your team, plan for days where you can work all in the office together. Or if you have people across the States or across North America or across the globe, have 1 or 2 meetings a year where you're all meeting in person, because you can't underestimate the impact of meeting somebody in person.
All right. Here's the question that always comes up in university classrooms and in the work we do, talking to senior leaders. People will ask me this question: Can anyone become an effective leader, or are there some people who just aren't suited for the work of leadership? Are some people, and I've had friends who have said this to me, I just don't want the hassle. I'd rather just worry about myself and be really good at what I do and not have to worry about that person doing what they ought to be doing. Can you take anyone? Can I grab anyone off the street, send them to you, and you send them back to me 3 months later, a good leader? Yes, that's a guarantee. On the record, folks.
Yep, on the record. That's what I do. I take doers and I turn them into leaders. Now, I promise you, I can turn you into a good leader, but I'm not going to guarantee that you like leading other people. It's a combination of desire, and some people are good leaders, but still don't enjoy doing it. So you have to like working with people. And so it's really interesting. I actually had a client once who head up a finance department. And he said to me, we were doing a disc assessment session with his team. And he said, Vanessa, can you keep an eye on this one individual on my team? I'm thinking of firing her. And I was like, wow, okay, sure. I'll keep an eye and see if there's any feedback. And after the session, I said to him, not only are you not going to fire that person, you're going to promote her into a leadership role. So she was in a finance department with a lot of people who are very left brain and analytical and detail oriented and so good at their jobs. And she was much more of a strategic thinker and very relationship oriented. And so he did that. And she became one of the most successful leaders he's had on her team. So some of it is temperament, but a lot of it is tools. Can anyone learn how to give feedback? 100%. Can people understand their strengths and weaknesses as a leader and really learn to leverage their strengths and dial down their weaknesses? 100%. Can people learn how to coach? You bet they can. So I see leadership as a sport. It's like, can anyone learn how to play tennis? Of course they can. Now, does that mean we're all going to Wimbledon? Probably not. But leadership really is like a sport. You can definitely learn how to do it and do it well.
That's a great analogy. And I always like to conclude these episodes with our guests giving my audience just some ideas on things that they can do immediately to become a better leader, to build a better team. What's one thing that's practical that a listener can take from this conversation and begin applying today or tomorrow that will help them get better results?
In one word, I'd say preparation. Okay. Don't wing it. I have leaders all the time who say to me, oh yeah, I've just got this performance review meeting and I'm just gonna, go in there and see where a conversation takes us. No, have an agenda, plan for your meetings, manage your performance conversations. If you have to give difficult feedback, prepare. If you need to execute strategically on a new project, plan your project. So for me, leadership is a lot about preparation.
That's great advice. Great advice. So, Vanessa, I've enjoyed our conversation. If people want to continue the conversation with you, learn more about your work, perhaps engage you for coaching or other leadership development work you do, how would they do that? What would be the best way for them to reach you?
So go into Google and type in Mosaic People Development or www.mosaicpd.com. All my information is there. Also, connect with me on LinkedIn. Just send me a request and I would love to connect with you on LinkedIn as well.
That's great. We'll have that contact information in our show notes today as well. Vanessa, thanks for being a great guest on the Mission First People Always podcast, where we talk about creating leaders and building better teams. So you were right in our sweet spot today. So thank you for being here. I'm going to take away from this conversation with Vanessa that it all starts with self-awareness. That is an area of focus in my own practice as I help organizations prepare for every conversation by acknowledging who you are working with, what you're trying to accomplish in that conversation, and try to bring out the best in the people you're working with, because ultimately that is the responsibility of every leader, to bring out the best in the people around them. And if you're making that transition from doer to leader, you can become a great leader. Vanessa guaranteed it. So thank you, everyone. God bless. Hope to have you again on another episode of the Mission First People Always podcast. Until next time.
It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to create a stronger, more people-centric and empowered culture for your organization, visit drmikepatterson.com.